Welcome to this week's lecture. I'm going to end the course by thinking about sensitive and controversial issues in the context of teaching history, and I've just split this week into two parts. The first, I'm going to deal generally with thinking about the place of history and the place of controversial topics in the teaching of history, and in the second part I'm going to focus on the specific issue of patriotism and teaching around national identity as an example of a controversial issue that history teachers are engaged with, and indeed as an example of how controversial history can become in the context of constructing curricula. So we start with a quote from Novick, and this really kind of leads us back to a fundamental debate that we started the year with, which is to think about, are we teaching history as the discipline of history, or are we teaching history as a series of moral lessons? Novick says if there are lessons to be extracted from encountering the past, that encounter has to be with the past in all its messiness. Those lessons are not likely to come from an encounter that's been shaped and shaded so that inspiring lessons will emerge. So he's arguing here that we need to give children the opportunity to engage with the complexity of history and not give them pre-digested narratives that adults have decided contain the germs of a lesson that they want them to learn. So this leads us back full circle really to the very first long lecture that started our module on history education, where we talked about the nature and purpose of history education. Is it to deliver pre-made narratives for children just to understand and accept, or is it for them to learn about the academic discipline of history and to use that as a lens for understanding the world in a critical manner? Now, that's the traditional way of dividing the debate, but it's of course the two extreme ends of a range of opinions. And so there are other possibilities. Now, lots of the writing in England around controversial history focuses on the Holocaust, and Short in that context has argued against Novick's position and for the idea that there is a kind of middle ground in the teaching of history. And what Short wants to argue is that when teaching sensitive areas of history, we can still be helping children draw lessons out, and these are three of the most obvious lessons that he said he would want to focus on. The first is to learn that understanding the importance of commemoration is part of who we are, as part of living in a democratic society. And he says it's really important for children, through studying controversial and sensitive and emotive aspects of history, to learn that some events are so significant to the whole of our society or to significant portions of it that we simply can't forget them, and there's an important civic act, if you like, in the constant commemoration of those events. The second purpose or series of lessons we might seek to align history to is around multicultural education, and in this case learning about sensitive and emotive aspects of history might help us gain some insight into the experience of others' construction of identity and others' cultural heritage. And then the third area is to focus on moral education and to begin to think about the decisions and judgments that people made in history as moral acts, and to think about the light that sheds on the act of decision making and forming one's own moral response to contemporary issues. So without predetermining what the moral lessons should be, or exactly what you want them to learn as an outcome of multicultural education, what Short is saying is that we can construct opportunities in the classroom to explore these issues and lead children to reflect on these historical events, people and processes in the context of these contemporary aims of education. So that's subtly different from saying the teacher needs to predetermine what the learning objectives are in all regards. So I've framed this as teaching about controversial issues. There's a definition in this teaching resource. It's not quite a resource, it was a report produced for the government and for the teaching community with government money from the Historical Association, which is based in the UK. Their opening definition of what they mean when they talk about emotive and controversial history has two important dimensions. The first is this, that it can be emotive or controversial where there's an actual or a perceived unfairness to people by another individual or group in the past, and so the controversial or sensitive nature of that is the act of injustice, and obviously young people often get very motivated by issues around injustice or unfairness as they perceive them. So that's likely to cause a controversy. But the second reason is interesting. So they say it may also be the case where there are disparities between what's taught in school history and family, community and other histories. So such issues and disparities create a strong resonance with students in particular educational settings. So here's a classic example. If we are teaching a single narrative about the formation of a multicultural state, or if we're teaching a single narrative about how fantastic the formation of our democracy was and how inclusive democracy is, but children come from minority groups where they're aware that actually it wasn't smooth and unproblematic. There was a bumpy route to get to where we've got to today, that actually democracy isn't perfect. There are inequalities in society. There are some people who don't access the same level of goods and services, who don't have equal voice in the way that decisions are made in contemporary society. Children will know that. They're not ignorant of the life that their parents and their communities live around them. And so what the Historical Association are doing is saying that it's not just in the nature of the topic that we might define controversy, it's in the way that children will engage with it. And wherever children have alternative interpretations from their families and communities, and they experience the interpretation we're giving them in the classroom as some kind of official curriculum, where they experience those as two separate histories, then that makes that topic controversial. So here's Alan McCulley, who is a history educator here in Northern Ireland, an example of his thinking around this issue. And he picks up this second dimension to the definition head on, really. He says that some pupils in Northern Ireland seem to him to carry around two versions of history in their head: the rational analysis encouraged in school, and which is useful for passing exams, but the partisan loyalty valued outside of school still persists. So the example here might be in Northern Ireland communities which are divided along Catholic, Protestant, and that's often aligned with unionist or nationalist sentiment as a kind of political allegiance or set of political beliefs. And he's arguing that here the school might be promoting a kind of an open approach to disciplinary history, where we consider all of the perspectives, we think about all the evidence, and we understand how narratives are constructed and the purposes for which they're constructed. But at home that will clash with a simpler, a more ideologically informed version of history. And it might be the other way around, that if school is promoting a narrow ideological form of history which is rubber stamped by government, and children understand that it's more nuanced than that because of the diversity in their communities, then it's the same issue of kind of mismatch that we have to engage with. So that implies that it's important for history teachers to listen to students' constructions of history and give them time to think about the contradictory nature of some interpretation. So we can really use this disjuncture as a creative educational resource. But the trick is, I think, to bring those two together in the classroom and to challenge children to think about the disconnect between these competing versions, not just to allow them to carry on unconsciously parking the school version in the back of their mind, but really carrying on believing in something else which is informed by a different set of principles or processes. So the trick here, I think, is to bring those beliefs to the surface in the classroom, encourage children to recognise these two versions don't actually match up, so that they perceive the cognitive dissonance, that they perceive there's a tension between them, and then we can spend time in the classroom seeking to resolve and discuss and debate the various interpretations. So use the skills of history to think about what it is we carry around in our head as a set of beliefs and value commitments. So the report suggests that there are a number of constraints that prevent teachers from doing this on a routine basis. The first obvious constraint is a lack of teacher subject knowledge. Very often the textbooks don't deal with controversial issues, and unless we've studied them ourselves, we might simply be fairly ignorant of the controversial topics and therefore feel not very well equipped to engage with them. The second, and this is related to that in a way, there's a lack of high quality resources, especially where there are government endorsed textbooks that promote a single dominant narrative. So where are we going to get these alternative perspectives from? Where are we going to get these different events documented for us in ways which are usable in the secondary classroom? The third is a tendency towards pedagogic conservatism. That's this notion that many teachers just want to play it safe. We don't want to take unnecessary risks in the classroom. And that's linked, I think, to the fourth one, which is that history teachers very often have relatively little time on the curriculum, but a huge chunk of knowledge to get through, very full textbooks, very full exam papers. And so we always need to be getting through history. We're always under pressure to whiz through different periods of time, and there's relatively few opportunities to pause and really have time to think about particularly controversial issues very deeply. There's also a fear of teachers or teachers being fearful that they will come across as insensitive. This is especially the case if you're teaching a diverse group of students from minority communities, religious or ethnic communities, and you're not from that one of those communities. It's very easy to very much feel like an outsider and a non-specialist engaging in conversations where you feel you're not very well informed to engage with them, and we fear as a profession very often coming across as ignorant or as simply insensitive or caricaturing people we don't know terribly well and we don't understand their lives and their cultural heritage. So there's that fear that drives us playing it safe. And then finally, perhaps, with younger children especially, a fear of making history too complicated. We quite like the idea that they can grasp the story of history and they can represent it to us in presentations and exam papers, and we don't want to overcomplicate things by really promoting this idea that there are multiple perspectives and multiple narratives and it's all very complicated to work out what was really happening and what people really thought about what was happening. And so we kind of play along with this urge to simplify history, especially in the lower secondary curriculum. But the report also suggests that there are some elements of good teaching that we can focus on. Now these are important, I think, because they kind of flag up for us aspects of good practice that we've talked about through the whole course so far, but these are particularly noted as helpful when you're dealing with controversial and emotive history as well. So the first is to be very clear about your purpose. And that may well be linked to thinking about aspects of disciplinary history, or it may, as Short was arguing, be linked to giving children opportunities to think about moral decision-making processes or potential people who are being promoted as moral leaders, and to think about those people in context. So we need to be very clear what the point of this is. It's not just to stir up a controversy, it's to explore the controversy, to learn something from it. The second is one of those bigger issues that we need to really think about in terms of the context we're teaching this in. They say that a school culture that encourages reflection on identity, values and diversity is particularly helpful for teachers who want to teach about emotive and controversial history. If you don't work in such a school, then you need to think about how you can engage with that and how you can create a safe space in the history department where you can engage with that process of reflection. Also, an emphasis on independent inquiry for the children and encouraging children to come up with their own questions in history is helpful, because that gives them space and legitimacy to really think through the controversy and to ask you questions and to ask each other questions and to think genuinely without a fear that there's a right or a wrong answer or a right or a wrong question and they'll look foolish by not knowing what that is. So creating space where children are used to asking speculative questions and posing questions and problems and working through them. The next one is related to this need to keep moving on through the curriculum, moving on through chronology. So they say it's really important, if you want to teach a controversial or emotional subject very well, that you must make time to do it properly. And if you can't make the time, my advice would be don't do it, because there's nothing worse than whizzing through something which is really deeply controversial and that children could be really interested in and just glossing over the surface. You probably are better not doing it. But of course you're even better whizzing through some other topics to make some time to really focus in depth on whatever the issue is you want to look at and think through those issues to some kind of clear outcomes. So they say the other thing that's useful here is if children are used to a history which is taught through multiple narratives and perspectives, because of course that trains them in the discipline of history and it prepares them for the complexity they'll encounter. It's up to the teacher to ensure balance, so that's about finding other complementary resources to bring to the classroom, and also, of course, bringing other perspectives into the classroom. It may be that all the children agree on a particular interpretation quite early on in the study, and it's up to the teacher to present in convincing ways, alternative accounts that make the children stop and pause and think about and accept the complexity. And then finally, the variety of resources is also useful, not just because it ensures balance, but because it engages pupils and really draws them into the topic and reflects the diversity of perspectives involved in those issues. So this opens up the need to think about the kind of roles that the teacher adopts in the classroom. Kitson and McCulley, again writing about Northern Ireland, said they discovered 3 types of teachers when they interviewed teachers in local schools. Here, those who avoid controversial issues completely, those who they described as containers, who teach controversial issues but tend to really focus on the historical processes, and also have a tendency to find controversial cases from other societies in the hope that children will draw parallels. So one example would be in Northern Ireland, they found a lot of teachers they classified as container type teachers who taught not about the Northern Ireland troubles, but taught about the divisions between Israel and Palestine, and looked at that as a small geographical area where there are intense ethno-religious and political divisions that lead to sustained violence, and where there's a very difficult ongoing peace process that doesn't really lead anywhere. And they were saying people in Northern Ireland who go for this approach tend to teach more about that in the hope that children will be able to draw parallels back to their own life, but it's too risky for them to teach about the Northern Ireland conflict in and of itself here. And then finally, their third category is people for whom it's not too risky, they take the risks, they deal with contemporary issues, and then they connect them deliberately to history. These teachers, they say, embrace the potential of history to be useful in dealing with current problems and controversies. But it's important to remember that there are these other types of teachers, and if you want to move into that third category, then we need to think about how to manage the risk. Another way to think about teacher roles is provided by Harwood, not necessarily in the context of history, but he's just talking about how teachers can manage the situation differently when they're managing debates and discussions about controversial issues in general. And he says you could just be the participant, you can take sides and you can participate with the children. You can be the devil's advocate, which is to argue for a position which seems to be underrepresented in the classroom, just to try and make sure that all opinions are heard. You can be an impartial facilitator, which is just to be a kind of neutral chairperson and to encourage the children to represent different roles and to work their way through materials. You could be the instructor, who's about being not just so much the facilitator, but being a bit more interventionist. You might interview children, you might draw out their answers to make sure that different views are represented increasingly clearly. And finally, you could be the committed instructor, which is basically, as Harwood would describe it, is a teacher who goes in hard with their own opinion and tries to encourage children to shift their beliefs to come into alignment with the teacher's own. Now, clearly, in a democratic classroom, or in a classroom in a democratic society more generally, being a committed instructor is a tricky role to pursue, I think, and you'd need to be very, very clear indeed that you were promoting a moral position or an ideological position that was entirely supported by school and by families before you adopted that kind of a role, I think. So one of the other decisions that teachers have to make, in addition to the kind of role they'll adopt when they're managing discussions, is the kind of resources they'll bring to the classroom. Now, we've talked a lot about resources over the course so far, so I'm not going to summarise all of that again, but I will just point out that Marcus and Stoddard, in a fairly recent article, recommended documentary film as particularly useful for history teachers teaching about controversial issues, and in that context for considering multiple perspectives. And so they say that documentary films are very useful for using as sources of information, because very often they splice together lots of interviews or lots of documentary footage, so they're a really good compilation of first-hand evidence. But secondly, they also provide you with a deliberately constructed interpretation of the event, or just the debates about the event. So we can use them on both levels as containers of information and as deliberately cut and pasted interpretations. and we can think about the objectives or the intentions of the people that constructed these films. So I was thinking about this in relation to the topics that you might be teaching, and looking around on YouTube. There's a video here which is a fairly accessible account in English of the 1969 racial riots in Malaysia from the perspective of 3 women representing 3 different ethnic groups in Malaysia. And it struck me, I'll put the link up on the Queen's Online site as well. It might be worth having a look at this in the context of what I've already said about teaching emotive and sensitive issues. Think about how that video could complement the narrative that's in the textbook around the 1969 race riots, and how you might use it in the classroom, like Short would recommend, to open up discussions around identity and multiculturalism in Malaysia today. Now, an additional useful source here, potentially at least, it depends on the class you've got and their maturity levels, but a useful resource is the comments that appear beneath the video in YouTube. Some of them are outrageous, they're aggressive, rude, racist, ideological in the extreme, but in providing that, those people may also provide a stimulus for discussion in the classroom. The hope would be that that's an additional resource that you might use if you were feeling brave and you felt the children were up for it, and it wouldn't be too upsetting for some people to read those comments, that you could use those as an additional resource and as a way into the topic. And an obvious question would be, why do you think these people have expressed those opinions? Why are there such different opinions of the 1969 race riots, and how do you think these 3 characters would respond to those kinds of comments? Useful for just opening up this territory, for thinking about how people position themselves in relation to history in different ways. So back to Macaulay, this time writing with Keith Barton. They said that when dealing with these kinds of issues in a history classroom, there were 3 lessons they learned from Northern Ireland. Now, Northern Ireland is particularly difficult to draw universal lessons from, so they do sound the warning bell here. They say they're offering these as lessons learned from this context, and they're just inviting us to think about, in other contexts, how useful would these be. But they said there were basically 3 recommendations for dealing with controversial issues. The first is deal with emotions, the second is mix up your teaching, and the third is to find support. So in relation to the first, Barton and Macaulay say it's really important to give space for emotions. And they also point out that in many ways it's the emotional response that actually makes something controversial. If people learn about a topic and no one cares about it, and no one's stirred by it, and no one's particularly interested in it, no one's drawn into the topic or thinks it's important, then the chances are it's not really controversial to them. So we have to be prepared that controversial history is a way of opening up people's emotions. They will have an emotional response. He says, Macaulay, that is, reflecting on his teaching, that very often when you open up those debates in classroom, it might be the first time you've allowed children to think about these issues in a public forum outside of their families, and therefore it's almost like letting off steam from a pressure valve. So it's really important for the teacher to hold their nerve, knowing there's likely to be a peak of emotional outbursts, and then it will calm down. And really important to consciously make sure by the end of a lesson it has calmed down. So they call this the emotional intensity initial phase, the teacher holding their nerve, and then a final wind down phase where the teacher makes sure they reduce the emotional temperature before the children go back out into the playground or wherever they might be, because you don't want them going out with this emotional turmoil. The other important thing is to allow different opinions to be expressed, so don't rule some emotional responses in and some out, that we need to give children the space to talk about how they think and how they feel about these topics. And Barton and Macaulay also say it's that in their experience, that although we often think the teacher should be neutral, they say that by and large they don't think children are that easily biased in favour of their teacher, and that it's quite safe for the teacher to say what they think, to share their opinion, to model their analysis of their opinion, to talk about why they don't have other opinions and why they have these opinions, and that's a useful way to model a rational response to historical controversies. And also useful, they say, for a teacher to admit to their own uncertainties, to their own grey areas, to their own problems that they're still working through and trying to understand better, or to changes of minds over your lifetime. So they say it's quite helpful if the teacher can present themselves as someone who's grappling with this as a difficult issue, and that in itself is an important feature of role modelling, how to deal with the emotional dimension. So the second piece of advice from them is to engage with diversity. They say that the diversity within the class is a really useful resource when dealing with controversial issues, but they also stress that it's not just the big diversity. So in Northern Ireland, it's not just the diversity between Catholics and Protestants. In Malaysia, it's not just the diversity, let's say, between the Chinese population and the Malay population. It's also, they argue, an opportunity to explore the diversity within these groups. So it's really helpful to deconstruct for children these binary divides. It's not them and us. Within them and within us, there are lots of different opinions and lots of different ways of engaging with these controversial histories, and lots of different ways of constructing meaning. And so they say it's really helpful, even if it looks like your class is fairly homogenous and fairly similar, to explore the range of opinions they may have and others like them have, and use that as a way to construct a more nuanced and complex and differentiated sense of what identity is and what group belonging is, and how people might interpret historical events. And then the third thing they say is probably the most practical, and I would really say this is important advice. It's important when you're teaching controversial and sensitive issues that teachers don't put themselves in a position where they're taking risks on their own. So it's really important that you don't just walk into a classroom and do something off your own back, but you discuss this in advance. So you should get support from school management and definitely from colleagues in the department. This should be a collective decision to engage with difficult and controversial issues, because they're controversial by definition. Parents may be intrigued, if not upset or angry, at some of these debates being opened up if they're encouraging children to take simpler views. And so it's really important that you don't stand out alone as a voice for the role of history in opening up these areas, but that's a considered and collective response. And the other thing they point out is that you can link with other history teachers in the area to share resources and ideas and support. So joining local networks and teacher organisations is important, and of course making sure there's a curriculum justification for what you do. What emerges really strongly for me from reading their article is that teachers really need to think about what makes something controversial, and then to engage with that. And what makes something controversial is always specific, and that depends on your society, on your class, on current politics, on the specific issue you're looking at, and all of those issues will come to bear. So you need to be prepared to deal with that as a specific issue. So there's not a kind of off-the-shelf set of ideas that will help you teach about controversial history. Really, the secret lies in understanding what makes it controversial and being prepared to deal with that issue. So these are the references I've drawn on for this first part of the lecture, and in the second part we'll go on and look at the more specific example of patriotism as an area of controversy.